Many people fear solitude, believing it to be a sign of isolation, rejection, or weakness. But in reality, solitude is often the training ground where the strongest individuals are shaped. It is in the quiet, away from distractions, that people discover their true strength. Without the constant noise of the world, they learn to rely on something deeper than fleeting validation. They learn to rely on God, on their inner resilience, and on the purpose for which they were created. History and Scripture both show that solitude is not a punishment, but a preparation. When a person is alone, they are given the opportunity to reflect, to grow, and to develop a strength that cannot be shaken by external circumstances. Consider those who have walked through seasons of solitude before stepping into greatness. Moses was alone in the desert before he became the leader of Israel. Joseph was left in prison before he rose to power in Egypt. Even Jesus spent time alone in the wilderness before beginning his ministry. In each of these cases, solitude was not a period of weakness, but a period of strengthening, refining, and deepening faith. One of the most powerful aspects of solitude is that it forces an individual to confront their thoughts, fears, and doubts. When surrounded by people, it is easy to distract oneself from deeper issues, to seek affirmation from others, or to avoid the hard questions of life. But in solitude, there is nowhere to run from those thoughts. Instead, there is an opportunity to wrestle with them, to grow through them, and to find peace beyond them. It is in these moments that people discover they are not as weak as they once thought. They are stronger than they imagined because they are not standing alone. They are standing with God. The world often measures strength by outward success, social connections, and public approval. But true strength is built in the moments when no one is watching, when there is no applause, when the only encouragement comes from within and from above. That kind of strength cannot be taken away by circumstances because it is rooted in something eternal. Solitude is not something to be feared. It is a gift, a time of preparation, and a reminder that true strength is not found in the presence of people, but in the presence of God. Those who embrace solitude emerge stronger, wiser, and more ready to fulfill their purpose. Throughout history, God has used solitude as a powerful tool to prepare his people for greater purposes. Many of the greatest leaders, prophets, and servants of God were first led into seasons of isolation before stepping into their calling. This pattern is not by accident, it is by divine design. When a person is removed from the distractions of the world, their heart becomes more attuned to God's voice, and their faith is tested and strengthened. Moses spent 40 years in the wilderness tending sheep before God called him to lead Israel out of Egypt. Before he stood before Pharaoh, before he witnessed the Red Sea part, he was alone in the desert, learning patience, humility, and dependence on God. That time of solitude was not wasted. It was a season of preparation. Likewise, Elijah, the great prophet, spent time alone by the brook Cherith, where God provided for him supernaturally. In that season of isolation, he learned to trust God fully, which later gave him the strength to stand boldly on Mount Carmel against the prophets of Baal. Even Jesus, the Son of God, experienced solitude before his public ministry began. He was led by the Spirit into the wilderness for 40 days, fasting and facing temptation. It was a time of deep spiritual strengthening, a moment where he relied completely on the Word of God rather than earthly comforts. That season of solitude prepared him to preach, heal, and ultimately fulfill his mission on the cross. Many times when we find ourselves alone, we see it as a punishment or a season of abandonment. But God does not waste anything, especially not seasons of solitude. When he sets someone apart, it is not to break them, but to build them. It is in the quiet moments when no one else is watching that God does his most profound work in shaping a person's heart, character, and faith. If you are in a season of isolation, do not be discouraged. Instead, embrace it as a time of preparation. God is refining you, teaching you, and strengthening you for something greater. The solitude you experience today may be the very thing that equips you for the calling that awaits tomorrow. Trust that God is at work, even in the silence, and that He is preparing you for a purpose beyond what you can see. There are moments in life when everything around us seems loud, when the voices of the world, the pressures of society, and the weight of our own thoughts create a constant noise that drowns out what truly matters. In the middle of this chaos, we often long for answers, for direction, for peace. But what if the very thing we need most is not found in more noise, but in silence? Silence is not empty. It is full of God's presence. When we take the time to step away from distractions and sit in stillness, we create space for Him to speak. Throughout the Bible, we see that God often speaks in quiet moments. When Elijah stood on Mount Horeb, he expected to hear God in the mighty wind, the earthquake, or the fire, but instead God came in a still, small voice. It was in the silence that Elijah truly encountered the Lord. Many of us struggle with silence because we have become so accustomed to constant stimulation. We fill our days with social media, entertainment, and endless conversations, leaving little room for reflection or prayer. But God often waits for us in the quiet. When we remove distractions and quiet our hearts, we begin to sense His presence more deeply. He brings clarity where there was confusion, peace where there was anxiety, and direction where there was uncertainty. Jesus Himself sought silence often. He withdrew to quiet places to pray, to be alone with the Father, to seek wisdom and strength. If the Son of God needed moments of solitude, how much more do we? In those quiet moments, He wasn't just resting, He was listening. He was aligning His heart with the will of the Father. When we embrace silence, we allow God to shape us. We stop relying on our own understanding and start depending on His wisdom. It is in these moments that our faith grows, our spirits are renewed, and our hearts are transformed. If you feel like God is distant, if you are searching for answers, if you are longing for peace, pause, be still, listen. God is not absent, He is speaking. The question is, are you making space to hear Him? Loneliness is something we all face at different points in life. It can come when friends drift away, when dreams seem distant, or when life takes an unexpected turn. In those moments, it can feel as if we are walking through a dry and barren land with no one beside us. But while loneliness may feel like a burden, it is often a tool that shapes us, strengthens us, and prepares us for what lies ahead. Think about gold. Before it becomes something valuable, it must go through fire. The intense heat purifies it, removing impurities and making it stronger. The same is true for us. When we are stripped of distractions, when the comfort of others is removed, we are left with nothing but ourselves and God. And it is in that place that He begins to refine us. He shows us who we really are, reveals what needs to change, and teaches us to depend on Him completely. Throughout history, God has used loneliness as a refining process. Joseph was thrown into a pit by his own brothers and later imprisoned in a foreign land. Yet, in that season of isolation, God was preparing him to become a leader who would save nations. David, the shepherd boy, spent years alone in the wilderness before becoming king. Those lonely moments were not wasted. They built the character, faith, and strength he needed for his destiny. Even Jesus, before his ministry began, was led into the wilderness where he fasted and prayed alone. But when he emerged, he was ready to fulfill his purpose. When we go through loneliness, we often ask, why is this happening to me? But the better question is, what is God teaching me? Maybe He is teaching patience, faith, or perseverance. Maybe He is stripping away our need for human approval so that we learn to stand firm in His truth. Maybe He is reminding us that our worth is not found in the presence of people, but in the presence of God. Loneliness is not meant to break us. It is meant to build us. If we trust God in the process, He will use those seasons to prepare us for something greater. Instead of fearing loneliness, we should embrace it, knowing that God is working behind the scenes, shaping us into who we were always meant to be. In life, we often seek the approval of others. We want to be liked, accepted, and valued by those around us. It's natural to desire connection and affirmation, but there comes a time when we must ask ourselves whose approval matters most, the world's or God's. Many people spend their lives chasing the opinions of others, adjusting their values and compromising their beliefs just to fit in. But the truth is, human approval is fleeting. People's opinions change, their loyalty shifts, and what they praise one day, they may reject the next. If we build our confidence on the applause of others, we will always feel uncertain, always striving but never satisfied. God's truth, however, never changes. His word is a solid foundation that does not move with the shifting tides of culture or human opinion. When we stand on God's truth, we stand on something eternal. We find security in knowing that we are not defined by the praise or rejection of people, but by the unshakable love of God. The Bible reminds us in Galatians 1:10, am I now trying to win the approval of human beings or of God? Or am I trying to please people? If I were still trying to please people, I would not be a servant of Christ. These words challenge us to examine our hearts. Are we living for the applause of the crowd, or are we living for the approval of the one who created us? Standing on God's truth requires courage. There will be moments when choosing His way means standing alone. People may misunderstand you, criticize you, or walk away from you. But even in those moments, you are not alone, because God is with you. He strengthens those who put their trust in Him, and He honors those who remain faithful to His word. The world may offer temporary approval, but God offers something far greater: His unwavering presence, His guidance, and His eternal promises. When we seek His approval above all else, we find a peace that the world cannot give. We find confidence that is not rooted in what people think, but in who God says we are. So today, choose to stand firm. Choose to trust in God's truth, even when it is not popular, because in the end, it is not the opinion of man that will matter. It is the voice of God saying, well done, good and faithful servant. Many people see solitude as something to fear, something to escape from as quickly as possible. But what if I told you that solitude is not a punishment, but a divine appointment? What if the very season of loneliness you are walking through is actually God's way of preparing you for something greater? Throughout history, God has used solitude to shape and strengthen those He calls. When Moses fled Egypt, he spent 40 years in the wilderness before God spoke to him from the burning bush. It was in that time of isolation that he learned humility, patience, and dependence on God. Before Elijah saw the fire fall on Mount Carmel, he had to endure a season alone by the brook Cherith, where God sustained him. Even Jesus, before beginning his ministry, withdrew into the wilderness to fast and pray. Solitude was never a sign that God had forgotten them. It was proof that He was preparing them. The same is true for us today. Sometimes God will pull us away from the noise, from the distractions, and even from the people we depend on, so that we learn to depend solely on Him. When we are stripped of everything else, we are left with what matters most: our relationship with God. It is in that place of quietness that we truly learn His voice, feel His presence, and understand His purpose for our lives. Maybe you find yourself in a season of loneliness right now. Maybe you feel abandoned, misunderstood, or like no one sees what you are going through. But let me tell you, God sees you. He has not left you. In fact, He is using this time to strengthen you, to build your faith, and to prepare you for what lies ahead. Do not rush through this season. Do not despise it. Instead, embrace it. Use this time to pray, to seek God, and to grow in ways that wouldn't be possible in the busyness of life. Solitude is not a curse. It is often the place where God does His greatest work in us. So when you find yourself alone, remember, you are never truly alone. God is with you, shaping you, molding you, and preparing you for the incredible things He has in store. Trust Him, embrace this season, and walk forward with faith.